Okay.
Great. All right. So whenever I start talking about food recovery and food composting efforts in Maine, one of the first things we look at is what's out there actually for waste. And there's a couple of different ways to look at it. We did a survey back in 2011 and found that roughly 28 to 40% of Maine's waste stream consists of organic material. And I went deeper into it, and nationally it's about 25 to 44%. And the most startling statistic really out there is that the average person wastes about 200 pounds of food a year. And that's material that they may buy and never ever eat, or they prepare and don't finish it all and end up wasting it. And the problem is that once put in a landfill, they're never available to do anything else further. Whereas once they're recovered, we can actually use them for higher and better uses of life. So in 2016, we've been working on food since 2004, but in 2016, we adopted what's called Maine's food recovery hierarchy. And the way that it works is if you look at the top of this upside down pyramid, you start out with reducing unwanted food, and that is the same thing as source reduction. And what it means is that we shop smart, we only produce what we can eat, we don't produce more than we need. Oftentimes buffets will generate 20 to 30% more than they think people will eat just so they don't run out of food. We don't do any of that. We make sure that we're very sharp and very smart. When that doesn't happen, which is often the case, we then look for other outlets for that food above disposal. One of the first ones is to donate to hungry people, either through food banks or working on getting hot meals to hungry folks. And there's actually a process going around the country where meals that were once in a buffet are taken and kept warm and brought to a homeless shelter and fed to people while they're still warm before they have a chance to cool down and have bacteria and stuff colonize them. So that's something that's being pushed, and we're hoping to get that into Maine one day. When the food is not edible for humans, there's still a possibility that it might be good to feed animals, especially cattle and hogs and things like that. So we go for that priority. When the food is beyond that level, then we look at either converting it into a biofuel and making energy out of it, or composting. And composting, the advantage of that is that the nutrients that are generated in the compost can be returned to the soil and help create a beneficial use. Finally, we have disposal options, and there are two. There's waste to energy, which burns it but still produces energy. And then there's direct landfill, which is the least preferred option out there. So when we talk about composting, as I explain it to people, it is a biologic process, and we take raw organic materials that were once alive, and through the natural biological aerobic activity, aerobic meaning with oxygen, it's converted into a stable soil additive that improves the soil in a multitude of ways, which I'll describe in a few minutes. But the whole process is done by microscopic organisms. Some of the benefits of composting, the first thing is it adds organic matter to the soil. That's the same as feeding your soil food. It's a really, really good thing. But one of the really big ones that was especially important the last couple of years here in Maine is that it increases water holding capacity, and therefore during drought, soils that normally would be dried out because they have compost hold on to water, and those crops are drought tolerant throughout that time period. Simultaneously, if the soil is really thick and compacted, working compost in can actually make it loose and allow nutrients and water to infiltrate into the soil. When compost is placed on raw soil surfaces, it can help to stabilize and reduce erosion losses. And when you add compost, which is still living and active, to a somewhat tired soil, it can actually increase the microbial activity. As I said, it does decrease soil compaction, but some of the more important ones are that we're actually finding that when you add compost to the soil and it interacts with the root system, it actually can make those plants a little bit more resistant to diseases and a little bit more tolerant to pathogens that come in into the soil and come through the air. So it's kind of an exciting piece. It's almost similar, without getting into the vaccine discussion, when you put the compost in the soil, it actually supercharges your plants and inoculates them to make them a little more strong when it comes to diseases. And then the biggest thing that I love about compost is that it takes raw organic nutrients and it ties them up into a complex compound that gives the nutrients off very slowly, similar to going to the bank and putting your money in the bank and taking out a little bit with your ATM card. It's very similar. So, and we can talk more about that in a little bit. So in order for a compost pile to work, you've got 5 major characteristics. You have your carbon to nitrogen ratio. Carbon is the food source, the energy of microbes. Nitrogen is what they use to make more microbes to complete their life cycle. So we have a certain ratio that we look for of those two. Oxygen is wicked important because oxygen drives the process. And when you have oxygen, you don't have odor. When you do it without oxygen, there's often a lot of odor present. And oxygen is dependent upon the ability of air to enter into the compost pile. That's called porosity. The moisture content is super important because the microbes live on the moist film on the surface of the particles. And we want our compost to be around 55% moist. And the simplest way to do that is by what's called the squeeze test, where you grab a handful of compost and you give it a squeeze in your hand. If water comes out between your fingers, it's too wet. If you open your hand and it crumbles out, it's too dry. And if you squeeze it and open it up and you have a ball that's moist, it's perfect. pH is not that big a deal, but compost likes to be between 7.2 and 7.5. And then particle size is very important as well, because particle size determines how well air is going to penetrate into the pile and also how available the food is going to be for the microbes. So I'm going to talk about each one of these a little bit as we go. So the first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is that carbon to nitrogen ratio. It is nothing more than the total supply of carbon compared to the total supply of nitrogen in a compost mix. What happens is that when you put sawdust shavings, for example, into a pile of compost, the carbon to nitrogen ratio of sawdust shavings is 400 to 1. The carbon to nitrogen ratio of shrimp waste, for example, is 2 to 1. When you mix those two together, we're hoping to get a ratio of around 30 to 1 in order for compost to work. So it means that you've got to add a lot of shrimp to balance out that 400 to 1. So when we start talking about that, people get really confused and really upset or lost. So basically the philosophy is that you take 1 part of the nitrogen, which is called green, and you mix it with 2 parts of the carbon, which is called basically the browns. So if you have a mixture of 2 parts brown to 1 part green, you'll normally have a carbon to nitrogen ratio around 30 to 1. So it's a really simple process. And the way that we do food is I have people build a pile of horse manure or other biologically active material and add their food to it slowly. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we actually go over the system itself. So carbon, as I said, is leaves and wood shavings, cardboard. It's anything that really doesn't smell if it's left in a pile and doesn't break down and doesn't cause a lot of leachate. Leachate is the liquid that oozes out of a pile. So carbon is usually very high. It has a C-to-N ratio of around 30 to 1 to 400 to 1. And it tends to be things like leaves and wood shavings and cardboard, heavily bedded manure like horse manure, goat manure that has a lot of shavings in it, shredded newspaper, wood chips, and so on. Sorry about that, that's my dog. The nitrogen tends to be the things that break down readily and tend to be really smelly. Things like cow manure, it's not bedded, can be very smelly. That's one that can be a real problem. And then fish gurry and shrimp and things like that. Food scraps are considered to be nitrogen. So once again, the idea is to create that ideal recipe, which we'll talk a little bit more about. In the presence of those 2 items, we also need to have good oxygen. And the way to think about that is in a pile, if you have high oxygen, you're going to have an efficient compost and it's not going to smell. If you have low oxygen, it's going to slow down and there'll be high odors. The quickest way to give yourself low oxygen is to make your pile too wet. With the squeeze test, we wanted about 55% moist. If it's too wet, oxygen can't penetrate, and therefore your oxygen goes way down and the microbes start to work anaerobically, and then the odors come up and get really stinky. And that can be a problem. So we say that the optimal amount of oxygen in a compost pile is between 5 and 10%. And one of the things to really think about, and in another life, I was a paramedic. When you give CPR to someone, you're giving a rescue breath. The way to think about it is that when you breathe in air, it has 21% oxygen. When you exhale 16%. Your body only uses 5%, just like a compost pile. So when we mix our compost pile, 21% oxygen goes in, but very quickly it's reduced down to only 5% in the inner pile as the rest escapes through the pores of the compost. And it is by far the most efficient way to compost. So another way to look at it is that when we're checking our compost, the only tool that we really ever use is a thermometer. And we're looking for temperatures in excess of 131 degrees. And the reason why that temperature is there is not we're looking to kill stuff, we're not looking to do things. What it tells us is that we have a good population of microbes in our pile. Because think about a compost pile as being full of microbes, and when they're happy and active, they generate heat. And that collective heat is trapped within the insulative layers of the compost. And as that heat gets up to 160, it means lots and lots and lots of bugs are really happy. 160 is a temperature where we have thermophilic bacteria. They are by far the most active in composting. And when you have thermophilic bacteria, it means that you have really good oxygen in your pile. So it means it's working super well. So some of the phases and these names, you don't really need to know more than just to understand. You initially mix it at day 1 or day 0, they call it. The first phase, which is the first 72 hours, it goes from ambient to 110 degrees. Now, below 104 degrees is what we call anaerobic activity. So any pile is going to have some anaerobic activity as it comes up to temperature. So you may get some smells initially as your pile is working. Once it hits 110, 120, the odors start to subside rapidly, and you start to get into what's called the thermophilic phase. And the thermophilic phase lasts for 4 to 6 weeks, and that's our hot, active compost phase. Now, the way that a compost pile works is that as long as the organisms have food, they work. Once they've eaten the food in their area, they'll go dormant and temperatures start to drop. And the only way to fix that is to mix the pile if you want to keep the process going. If you don't and you don't mind, then you can actually just let it set and it'll eventually compost slower anaerobically. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we do the different phases. And then the curing phase is where you take the compost out of the bin and you make a pile, you leave it in your backyard, and you let it naturally break down the rest of the way for about 3 to 6 months. So this is once again just showing you graphically how this looks. You start at the left with the mesophilic phase. It comes up to temperature. You have about a 4 to 6 week phase, and then it goes into curing, which is the longer period till it comes back down to ambient temperature. This is just an idea of the compost moisture content. We want it roughly to be 50 to 65%, which is that sweet spot when we do our squeeze test. And that's the only real tool that you need besides a thermometer to do a good job. This is a cool picture. What this does is it demonstrates where things are happening in a pile. So if you think about the particles as being the food source for the microbes, this free airspace is where the oxygen comes in, and this is the moisture. Where the three interface, like right in there, that's where composting happens. And so the way to think about it is that when you get the right mix of moisture and particles of food, nitrogen and carbon, you've got the ideal sweet spot for composting to happen. Now this one right here is pretty cool because you can see on the left, you have some really fine material. This is sawdust shaving or sawdust period. And this material is really absorbent. it's going to pick up moisture super well. But when it's wet and saturated, it's not going to let air flow through. So this would be a horrible compost mix by itself. The one on the right is really coarse, and it's going to let air flow through like crazy. It's going to hold the pile structure really good, but it's not absorbent because the particle sizes are really big and the surface area, there's not enough available. And when air blows through it, it's going to dry it right out, so it won't compost at all. What you want instead is this mixture right here, which is a mixture of coarse and fine particles. It's going to absorb liquid, but still let air flow through. And by far, horse manure with bedding, so horse from a stall, the sawdust shavings, goat bedding, and some of the even guinea pig manure has the right amount of energy, the right amount of particles to do a really good job for you. This one right here is kind of cool. It shows you how air flows in a compost pile. And this pile actually had 650 chickens in it when we started. These were mortalities from an egg farm in Turner. And what we did is we put the birds in the middle. And as you can see, this middle is dark brown. It's very, very wet. This is the core of the compost pile. Now, if you go to the left and the right, you can see these little whitish areas. That's actually super dry material. And what caused that is the air was sucked in from the sides of the pile to make this active center super, super aggressively active. And then it exhausts out the top called the chimney. So because the airflow was so vigorous, it actually drew the moisture away from the sides of the pile. And that's how a good compost pile works. So when we start thinking about composting at home or even community-based composting, there are two systems available to us. There's what we call a batch system, which is like this simple bin here. And this is exactly what we have available for you at the end of this presentation. This is what the town of Reedfield has gotten for all of its community members that want to partake and participate. And the way this works is this is called lobster trap wire. It's very rugged. It's used to make lobster traps. It's steel that's galvanized and then coated with a heavy duty epoxy. I've got stuff that's 20 years old that still, I hit it with the hose each spring and it's brand new looking. It's super durable. And what I have is a section that's 4 feet tall by 12 feet long. The ones that Reedfield got, I believe, are 3 feet wide by 12 feet long. But you roll it into a cylinder and you overlap it by 3 squares. And then you connect it. I use a piece of coat hanger wire because that's very durable and it can be undone, so it's reusable. And I create this bin, and then I start to fill it up with layers of material. You put a 4 to 5 inch layer of horse manure on the bottom. And I keep saying horse manure because it is the most go-to material that I know of. But you put a layer of that much, and then you start adding food. And you add food the first day in the center, and you cover it with a little bit of manure. Then you keep adding until the full base up to a couple inches from the edge along the whole perimeter is full of food. And then you put a layer of horse manure over everything and start the next layer going up. Now, the reason why I leave a gap of 4 inches away from the edge of the compost bin is because turkeys stick their heads in the bin. And if you give that much space, they can't get to any food and they'll go away. But they will stick their head right through that wire. They're pretty crazy. So this is an example of one that's full of food and horse manure. You can see that we try to fill all the way to the top. This is at a school in Freiburg, and they work super well. This is the kids. Kids love these kind of activities. I love working with school children. So they're actually filling up the bin with food and other materials. This is not a good idea. This is someone who thought that the lobster trap bins were too expensive or they didn't want to deal with them. So they went and they bought some wire at Lowe's and they tried their own. And the problem is that those things are not durable. You can look at how beat up they are after only 1 year. They just don't work well. The lobster trap bins, they take a beating year after year after year and still come back strong. So definitely don't skimp, go for the good stuff. Some of the tools you might need, Starting from the far right, you got what's called a spade fork. It's the same as a pitchfork, but it's got thicker, stronger tines. And you can reach down through the top of the bin and you can work it around, and that will help you turn if you wish to. You don't have to, but you can if you wish to. The device to the side is a compost bin, similar to what you guys got, those little 2-gallon containers. A thermometer is a must. You can actually get away without one just by using your sense of smell and your touch. But if you really want to have fun with it, you can pick one up at a local hardware store. They're about 20 bucks for a decent one. And then the funniest thing that looks like a cane is called a wing digger. And basically the way that it works is if you look at these little silver things here, they're on hinges and they do this. So you push down into the pile, and then when you pull out, they spread out, and you're actually able to do this and pull holes and tear up the compost to help aerate it. So it's just another way to get the job done. This is a example of a community that doesn't like the lobster trap bins. So they developed what's called the 3-bin system. And basically it's not using pallets, it's actually using boards. And if you look inside here, you see this dark shaded area, that's actually mesh screening. And what the mesh screening does is it allows airflow, but it also helps keep the contents from escaping from the pile. Because a lot of folks want to try using pallets. And when you use pallets, if you don't add the wire in like you see here, what happens is that the nooks and crannies get full of stuff, and often rotting food will get in there and it'll attract rodents, and rats will dig up in there, and then you've got a problem. Now, if you want, there's another whole scale of systems. These are called the kinetic systems. And the way these work is you tumble them or you roll them, or in the case of the ball in the middle, you fill it up full of compost and then you let your kids kick it around the yard. It's about a 3-foot diameter plastic ball. And the idea is that this kinetic activity helps to mix and speed up the composting process. These systems are expensive. They don't hold a lot of material, and they require a ton of mixing in order to get the job done. You're much better off just using the lobster trap bins that the town of Reedfield bought for its group. They do so much better. If you do have an interest in going beyond the backyard bin to something a little bigger, there's the open pile system. And the open pile system means that you just get an appreciable amount of material. Like, for example, at the transfer station, they have a pile of material going that they're having people dump food into. That could be done at someone's home. But when you get above 5 cubic yards of material, you really should have a garden tractor turn it, because it gets to be hard on your back. It's a lot of work. But if you have a tractor, then you'll get bored with the little bins and want to go to something bigger. So people ask, now, how do I get started? What do I do? The first thing is that if you go to our website at the DEP, it's maine.gov/DEP. If you look up sustainability, I have a couple of guides on there that you're welcome to make as many copies of or ship to your friends, whatever. The first one talks about recovering and composting organics in Maine. It's every scale. And then the one on the right, the 10 steps, specifically looks at small composting, either at home or schools or daycares, things like that. They're both really helpful, and they're both free. You just have to log on and grab them. But in most cases, what I'm looking for is you get material at home. Say you get, in this case, I've got leaf and yard, but you might correct leaf and grass clippings and food from your house, and you mix it together, and then you place it into a pile or into your compost bin. And then the material, once it's finished, you can either use it for your garden use, or you can put it in a pile and share it with your friends or your community. Or in most cases, I see people turn it around their homes. It works really good. And I've been asked numerous times, I might as well address it here, can I compost cat and dog poop? And the answer is yes. But I ask that you compost it separate from your food, and then you place it around the outside edges of your property where you're not going to walk barefoot, because a lot of these animals, cats and dogs, have certain parasites that are readily transmitted to humans. and they like to get in our guts and develop, and we get tapeworms and other things which are not pleasant. So definitely you can compost cat and dog poop, just don't do it around any place where you're going to have a garden or do a lot of foot traffic. This is a really cool shot. This is the town of Yarmouth. Over here on the far right, that big pile is fresh leaves that were brought in the year before. The second pile from the right heading towards the left is the very first turn of those leaves. This one right here is about 6 months later, they turned it again. And if you notice, you see how we're changing color? We call that changing color gaining humus. So we go from a tan to a dark brown to a super dark brown. That right there is finished compost. And what that means is that all of the organic nutrients that were in those leaves are now tied up into humic compounds, which are going to fit in the soil and be broken down very slowly by the soil microbes and feed that soil for a very long time. So that's what you're shooting for, is that nice dark color. Now, this school right here blows my mind. And this is a school that could happen anywhere, including Maranacook community, any of the other schools around. And this is a community where they have gardens where they grow food for the cafeteria. The students collect all the food scraps from the cafeteria, they bring them outside, and the local maintenance guy that does the work around the facility has a little tiny tractor that he does the work with, and they put the food into a big pile of horse manure, and he turns it with the tractor, and he ends up with this beautiful compost at the end of the year, which they then put into a cubic foot bag. And a cubic foot bag is a pretty small bag, and they use ones that aren't plastic, and they sell it for $5 at their local farmer's market. Now, here's the advantage. When you go and buy compost at places like DR Struck, or you go to some of the bigger places that have compost for sale, it'll be like $30 a cubic yard. If you do it by the cubic foot bag at $5 a cubic foot bag, there are 27 cubic feet in a yard. So very quickly, you go from $30 a yard to $130 a yard. And that's money that goes directly into scholarship funds, field trip funds, all kinds of cool stuff. So it's a really great incentive for kids. The other thing I notice when we do composting at schools is a lot of kids want to develop a community-based garden where parents, underprivileged kids, people that are food insecure can come and grow things and reap that harvest over the course of the school year. And it's just kind of a really cool way to tie a community together. So I look for all those kind of opportunities. This is finished compost from this guy. And from the left to the right is David Pope, is the science teacher. This gentleman, I forgot his first name, but he is the groundskeeper, and that's Mark Fisher, the principal. They work as a team, and this is the Massabesic Middle School, and they do a super awesome job. So it is definitely something that can be done. So people ask me, well, what does it take? Well, if you're going to do a daily compost at home, you need to collect the material. You don't have to weigh it, although weighing it gives you an idea of how much money you're saving. You collect it in your little 2-gallon container. Some people don't like to go immediately outside to the compost bin or to the refill transfer station. So they'll put it in a 5-gallon pail on their porch and wait a couple days until that pail is full. I really recommend that because it makes less trips to the transfer station. Therefore, your carbon footprint decreases. You take it to the compost site, drop it in the pile, add some bulky material, and then you rinse your bucket out. And the refill transfer station actually has a hose set up to wash buckets. And then, one of the fun things is that you can actually take temperatures if you want to. So it's kind of a cool thing. But really, honestly, it's the prep from the kitchen, it's the plate scrapings after you eat your meal. So really, you're talking about a half hour or so a day in order to get your food collected. What it would take you to dump it in the trash is the exact same that it would take you to pop it into one of the containers to then be reused at the compost site or your home compost bin. This is an example of a community where they do pre and post consumer. Students and adults bring the stuff to the site in 5-gallon pails. You can see that it's really good, clean stuff. That material is then taken, and I'll actually show you a picture in a second of a site where it's done really well. But it's taken to the site and it's dumped in the pile. But as far as the weekly tasks that you do, you make sure that your bins are well taken care of. If they're really dry in the summer, you can add water with a hose if you need to. And then the troubleshooting, if it's really stinky, it means that it's too wet. And the quickest way to fix that is to dig into it and add some fresh dry carbon. One of the best kind of dry carbon materials comes out of a lot of these coffee shops that roast beans. It's called coffee chaff. I get a lot of it from Carabasset Coffee up in Kingfield. It's a dry, fluffy material that smells like coffee, but it's super absorbent. And it works wicked good for helping to absorb moisture and killing odors simultaneously. There's lots of other things that work well too. Dry coffee grounds are a good way to kind of kill odors as well. So I wanted to give you just a little quick sort of a case study of a place. I graduated from University of Farmington in 1988 or 86, and I've been working with them ever since. We started a composting project back in 2005. I actually sat down with the gentleman that ran the Sandy River Recycling at Java Joe's, and we drew a facility on the back of a napkin. And then I brought it to the state planning office, and they granted us, well, I had to make it a little bit nicer than a napkin, but they loved the idea and they gave us $25,000 to build a facility. And this facility is still running today. It composts roughly 150 tons of food a year, and it does a super awesome job. And the best part is that the facility generates about 300 to 400 yards of compost a year, and we sell every bit of it for $30 a yard. And all that money is used to run the facility, so it doesn't cost the town or the university a cent to run the facility. It's all self-sustained due to compost sales. So it's a really great model to follow. But let me just give you an example. Here is food coming from the cafeteria. We initially started out with pre-consumer material. So that way pre-consumer is like vegetable scraps and choppings as you're preparing meals. It's not a lot of goo. It's not a lot of wetness. It let us kind of work through the process and make sure we're comfortable. Then after that happened, we actually took the post-consumer, which can be a lot more troublesome, and we worked it into the process. But all these things are brought in, they're weighed each day, and that gives us an idea how much we're saving. So this is just being transported. And you'll notice that the containers we have a screw top lid with a gasket seal. Little more expensive bucket, but it keeps odors down, especially during the hot summer months. The material is then dumped into a skid steer bucket. You can see that the college kids eat pretty good. That material is then brought over to a compost pile, which is nothing more than a large pile of horse manure. And that's the advantage. Horse manure is the best stuff going. And we basically put the food into the horse manure and let it just get digested by the compost. To give you an idea of how good that works, we've actually taken whole mortality cows that die on a farm. We'll put them in a pile of horse manure, and in 6 weeks, there's nothing but bones left. So the microbes in the horse manure are already biologically active, and when you give them a big food source, they just keep on going. So it's a really, really kind of a neat thing. So that's a big scale. How do I go back to my little bin at home? And the answer is really quite simple. When you build your bin at home, you start out with that about 5-inch layer on the bottom of horse manure all the way across the base. And then each time you dump your food, you add it to the center, and then you add it around the edges of the center until you're within 4 inches of the edge of the bin. So we're talking about a 4-foot diameter across the top of the bin. So you want to leave 4 inches away from all sides of it. So you basically have a active area that's in the inside with 4 inches of buffer on the outside. When your bottom is completely covered, except for those 4 inches, you then cover everything with a layer of horse manure and start fresh to the next level. And what will happen is you'll eventually get to the top of your bin. Usually that should take you most of the summer. Then you can decide, do you want to keep feeding it in the winter? If you don't, that's when you can start bringing your food to the transfer station and put it in their pile, which they run year round. If you want to, you don't have to, but you can, or you can just choose not to compost in the winter and just wait until the spring. And what's going to happen is that container is going to hold a cubic yard. And the research that I've done several different publications. The research that I've done shows that 1 cubic yard bin will stay hot all winter long. So it'll compost right through the winter. If you make less than a cubic yard, like some of those plastic earth machines, it freezes. And people are like, it's frozen. Doesn't matter. In the spring, it thaws and becomes active again. The difference is that if you want to keep composting through the winter, your wire lobster trap bins will keep working. So that's kind of a good thing. And then the other question is, when is the compost finished? People ask that a lot. And the answer is that if you do your, I'm from the age of Ron Popeil and the Ronco-matic stuff. And he had this device called the rotisserie. You put your beef in it, and his catchphrase was set it and forget it. That's sort of what these bins become to a lot of folks, is they'll build them, fill them, and then forget about them until the following year. And the way that you can tell that things are ready is in the spring, you undo your coat hangers, open up the container, set it beside the compacted material, which will be a tower of compacted material, reattach the coat hanger, and the top half of it you dump back into the bin, and the bottom half will be darker, richer, and you should start noticing worms crawling up inside it, because the worms come into it when it's done. That's one of the best ways to know your compost is finished. It'll be dark, it'll smell earthy, but there'll be lots of worms in it too. So that's the best way to tell. It's the simplest way to tell. So now what do? Well, we've got a couple of things going on, right? You can try a home compost bin, which is what people are hoping to do at the end of this session, which I'm totally excited about. You've started a small pilot at the transfer station, which hopefully will grow into something else. And one of my favorite phrases, I got this from being a paramedic, is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. You don't need to race. This is a war that's won through simple, small battles. So you try it, you get successful, you try a little more, and pretty soon, let's say we get 100 people in the Reedfield, Fayette, Wayne area composting. In the course of a year, let's say each one saves 10 tons of food. Well, that's a lot of food right there. So maybe they only spend 500 pounds of food, but 100 times 500 is a lot of food saved. And that's the way you got to look at it, is that a lot of people working together doing small things equal a big thing. So that is pretty much all I had to talk about. And I'll stop sharing in a second. Let's see here. Stop share. And you can go ahead and stop the recording if you want.